Hey, what's up, guys? If you're new to the channel, my name is Pablo Munoz Gomez. I'm a 3D concept and character artist, and I run the ZBrush Guides website. If you like the content that I'm sharing here on YouTube, feel free to subscribe and turn on the notifications so that you know when a new video is up. And in this video, I'm going to walk you through the process of creating your own custom asset. We're going to build a custom brush in ZBrush to add skin damage and kind of like a scar to your own creatures and characters. So right now, what I have here is the latest version of ZBrush at the time of this recording is 2021.6.3, and this is my custom UI. I just work on my custom UI because it is easier and faster, but I will point out any UI element that I use in the process. I'm going to go ahead and open up the left dock, and I'm going to bring in my brush palette, dock it to the right, and I'm also going to do the same thing for the stroke palette, and I'm going to put that on the right hand side. And that's it. That's pretty much all we're going to do. We're going to use for this tutorial. And obviously I have a single sphere, and I'm going to turn on polyframe so that you can see it's just a simple sphere. And what I'll do is just add a couple of subdivisions, which for you guys might be on the geometry, divide a couple times, so 4 subdivision levels, maybe one more, so we have 2 million polygons. And this is just so that we have enough resolution to test our brush. So it could be anything, like if you want to do it in a cube, it's totally up to you. All right, so the first part of this tutorial is to walk you through what are the simplest things or attributes that you can change in your brushes to alter the effect of the brush. So we're going to take the standard brush, which is the one that I currently have selected. You can access it by pressing the letter B, then S, and then T. That's kind of like a quick filter for that brush. And yeah, this is essentially the effect of that brush. Pretty straightforward, right? I'm going to undo that. And some of the things that we can do to alter the brush, obviously the simplest one would be to invert the Z-add and then just enable the Z-sub. If you're using the standard UI, these two elements should be around the top, but also under the draw palette, these are the two ones that I'm using. So this is basically the same thing as holding the Alt key. So with the standard brush, this is the standard effect. If I hold the Alt key, I'm just inverting the effect, right? So one pushes the geometry outwards, the other one pushes in. So that's just a quick element of customization. But you don't have to hold the Alt key. That's the point. You can enable this, and without holding the Alt key, you get the same effect. The other thing is you can turn off the lazy mouse. So if you go to the stroke palette, that's what I have it here, and you open up the lazy mouse section, you can turn that off. And the lazy mouse allows you to have a lot more control on your strokes, but as soon as you turn it off, it gives you a more like a smoother path, right? So if I go ahead and compare something with the lazy mouse, which again gives you more control, let's do a bit more pressure. You'll see it's not as smooth. You can sort of see the instances of that brush. If I turn that off and I do the same thing, you don't have that much control, but you have a lot more pressure in a way, like the effect is a lot higher. Oh, a lot more intense. All right, so I'm gonna undo that. So just with two things, with two switches, we basically change the standard brush. So we have the Z-sub enabled and the lazy mouse disabled. Now, the other cool thing about building brushes in ZBrush is that it kind of like works in a progressive manner. So you can start from like a very small detail and build your way up to something very, very complex. So I'm going to give you an example of that, and I'm going to use a brush that comes with ZBrush called the extractor brush. So with the standard brush, with those tweaks that we just did, I'm going to reduce my brush size. By the way, another element obviously to customize this brush is to tweak the Z intensity, but I think it's fine as it is. So I'm going to go ahead and do something like this, just pressing to create a dot. And that's, it seems like a pretty simple thing to do, but once you combine this with more of the steps that I'm going to show you, it becomes something very, very powerful. Now I'm also going to switch back to the Z-add, the one that adds geometry, and also enable lazy mouse. So this is basically resetting the standard brush, and I'm just going to go closer and maybe add a little bit of volume around that. It could be a pore, for example. And I'm going to hold the shift key to smooth things out a little bit. That's it, right? So let's go ahead and switch to the extractor brush. So you press the thumbnail, and I think what I'll do now is I'm going to turn off my camera so that you can see both of these things. a little bit easier. All right, so I'm gonna click on the brush thumbnail, and I'm gonna go all the way to, here we go. These three brushes, these are the extractor brushes. So I'm gonna click on this extractor drag rect, click on that. And I'm also going to go to my undo history here and go back to a state before I actually created that detail, right? And this is an important step because this brush works with the history. So let me just bring in the Epic Pen very quickly so that I can explain this a bit better. So essentially what this brush does is it looks at the surface. So imagine the yellow line is the surface, right? And we are going to record a point in time. So that's why we sort of went back a little bit where the surface is unaffected, right? So as soon as we record that, we are telling ZBrush, hey, remember this exact state of the surface. And then when we go back to where, you know, whatever detail we did, so this state right here, you know, the one that we created, that sort of hole or pore like that, right? We're going to tell ZBrush, look at the previous state that we recorded in this point, so this pink line, and just give us the difference between the previous state and the new state. So if you look at it from the side, and this is the original state, that one right here, and the new one is with the kind of like the hole in there, or like that little bump, right? ZBrush is going to analyze the difference between that previous state and the new state with the details that we created, and it's just gonna grab those and give us an alpha with just those details. So I know this might look a little bit more confusing than what it is, so I'm just gonna show you, but I wanted to give you a quick understanding of how that works. So in order to record this current state, what I'm gonna do is hold the control key on my keyboard and click on this timeline, or in this undo. And you'll see now we have this sort of white square right in the middle. So now let's go back to this state where we have the detail. So all we have to do now is press the G key on your keyboard, or alternatively, we can go to the alpha palette and we can click on this from brush. And you'll see now my cursor changes to this sort of aqua cyan color. I'm gonna click right in the middle and drag, click and drag, and this will determine the size of the alpha. So I'm gonna do something like this. And we'll just wait until ZBrush sort of computes that. Remember, it just needs to go back to that previous state that we sort of saved and then analyze the difference between those states. But that's pretty much it. It already did it. So let's bring in the alpha to the left, the alpha palette. And you'll see this is the new brush, or the new alpha, sorry, that was created for that brush. So now I can just go ahead and click and drag. And you see it's just an instance of that alpha, which is fantastic. So now that we have that, let's go ahead and place a couple more of those pores around, something like that. It could be pretty random, but you see the longer that you drag, the larger that detail is going to be. So you can just drag a little bit and make, you know, smaller points, right? Pretty straightforward. And if you want, you can also hold the shift key just to smooth out some of those so that they're not as intense and they can just work as a kind of like as a bump. And again, we can go back to, even in this brush, the extractor brush, which currently has the alpha that we extracted, we can simply invert that effect and we can click and drag, and now we're creating kind of like a pimple rather than a pore, right? So this is pretty convenient for this type of things, but I'm just gonna undo that, go back to what I had. And because if you notice, let me bring that one again. This is the point where we saved this alpha, but we have gone ahead and created all of these different states or different details, and we are currently here, right? So we still have the original stored that has none of these ones, right? Oops, with the right color. So that original state has none of these details that we just added. So we can basically go ahead and do another alpha from that sequence of alphas that we just generated. So in a way, all we have to do is, you know, to recap, create that single dot, then use the extractor brushes to create that alpha. And now that we have that sort of initial state still recorded there, we can go ahead and do the same process. So we go to the alpha, click on from brush, and we can go ahead and click and drag, and this time I'm gonna grab all of those dots, and we just need to wait until ZBrush computes that. And now we have an alpha that has all of those points. So when I click and drag, I have a more complex alpha, right? And I can keep doing this, and this process becomes kind of like an, exponential in a way. You start with a single dot, then you create this alpha, and now we have something that is even more complex, right? All of these dots. And if you wanted to, you can obviously keep going, right? So we still have that original state recorded. All we have to do is go to the from brush, click and drag, and let's just wait. There we go. So now we have even more complex alpha. We can do it on this side, right? So we have this alpha to generate these sort of pores if we wanted to. And something else that we can do to make this brush even more complex is to change the type of stroke. So right now, by default, this brush is using this drag red alpha to do this process. But if I go back to my standard brush, so let's go ahead and press BST. So this is the standard brush. I can go ahead and select one of the new alphas that was created with the previous brush. So let's select probably this one. Yeah, this one is fine, right? And I can click and drag, and you'll see it's not giving me the same result, obviously, because the standard brush is using a different stroke. So I can just switch to the drag rect, and that will give me the same effect. And the main difference is that, let's just drag it. You'll see if I rotate around, this actually creates a bit of a bump, right? So it adds volume. So this is the thing that I wanted to show you, and the reason I changed to a different brush. So now we have the standard brush, the same stroke type, but if we go to the modified tab here under the alpha, we can click on this surface. So what surface does is ZBrush is going to analyze what the best kind of like mid-range of these values in this alpha are going to be, so that it doesn't push things out. So in other words, it's going to try to find the middle grade. So if I do that, this is a little bit more subtle. All right, but obviously we can tweak the amount of the intensity, let's say 12, and we have something closer to what we had before. Now we can take this even further and click on the spray. So now the spray is just going to give us kind of like a spray version of that alpha. Maybe this is way too small. I think this one would work a lot better if we use the single alpha, the first one that we created, right? But you see how quick this is just to switch between these brushes and these alphas. That one is actually quite all right. Right? So very quickly, we can just go ahead and change from a standard brush, like the standard brush, and make, I don't know, this could be like a brush to create pores in ZBrush, right? And this is essentially how I go about creating my own custom brushes. Right now, this is obviously super basic, super simple. We've just tweaked a few things in the stroke palette, a few things from the actual brush palette, and some things in the alpha. So those are pretty much the three main elements or three main sections that we will be changing, right? The alpha, the stroke, and the actual settings of the brush. But again, this is super simple. Now we're gonna go ahead and create something a bit more complex. Now that you know this sort of basic tools to create brushes, we're gonna do something a bit more complex for that scar brush. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. So this is kind of like the second part of the tutorial. I'm gonna keep using this as a reference, but I'm gonna reset the standard brush. So we can go to the brush palette, and in here we have these two buttons to reset the current brush or all brushes. I'm gonna click on current brush. So now it resets all the settings back to its original state. So we have the same original standard brush. And what I'm going to do is what I did at the beginning. So I'm going to turn off the lazy mouse. And if you want, you can switch this C-sub. I think I'm going to leave it as C-add for the time being. And we're going to change the alpha. Okay, so instead of using the alphas that we created, that was just a demonstration of how quickly it is in ZBrush to create your own alphas. But we're going to use something that comes with ZBrush. Let's try alpha 54, right? So when you drag this one, this is the type of effect that you get, right? Pretty cool. Now the next two things that I want to show you that you can tweak is the roll distance as well as the orientation. So I'm going to start with the roll distance just to show you what it does. I'm going to draw one stroke in here, And I'm going to take the roll distance, and I'm going to go ahead and click on roll, right? So just to enable it, that setting right here is on the stroke palette, this one right here. So it's the same switch. So now what ZBrush is doing is taking that alpha and is rolling it. So like if it was a, like a roller to paint a wall, right? So in other words, what it is happening, this is the alpha, right? And here, sorry, this is the kind of like the square where the alpha is located. This is the actual alpha. As soon as we enable this roll, what ZBrush is doing is taking the whole placement or this whole square with the alpha and is just rolling it. So that is how you can create tileable alphas in a way, or tileable brushes. So right now what we're doing is just duplicating that alpha like so, right? Obviously it's happening with less spacing, but that's from a different setting that we're not going to look into because I'm interested in showing you some other stuff. All right, so I'm gonna leave this one there. And now I'm going to take that roll distance and I'm going to increase it by something crazy so that is pretty obvious. Something like, let's go for 6, right? And I can click and drag. And this is completely different, right? So what we're getting now is, if this is the alpha, right? And those are the dots in the alpha. When you take this roll and then increase the roll distance, ZBrush is going to roll. So it's going to duplicate that, but it's actually going to stretch the alpha. So that's why you end up with something that looks like that, right? So this roll distance and this roll are pretty convenient when you're creating some kind of like, weird looking brush like I'm about to do. All right, so those are the things that we're going to be doing. Now this doesn't look anything like a scar brush and we were going to try to make it look like a scar brush, but you can use any alpha, by the way. I just want to show you that I found that this one works all right, so you can use that comes with ZBrush. So the next thing that I would show you is the orientation, and that is under the brush palette, right? And orientation is pretty cool. I'm gonna enable, open this one up, and you'll see you have the spin center and the spin angle and the spin rate. So let's have a look at what these sliders do. Sometimes it's just easy to just play around with them. By default, it should be at 0, but if you take the speed center and change it to, let's say, spin center of 3, and you do the same thing, you'll see that everything is happening kind of like away from my brush. So in other words, this spin center is sort of like pushing things away from the pivot of the stroke. So I can do this, and it sort of like spins around my pivot or the center of my mouse. I don't know if you saw that, but basically it's just following me around like it would normally, like the normal effect of the brush, but it's sort of spinning around the point. So in other words, if you have, hopefully this is not too confusing. So if you have the alpha there, and this is the current alpha that we have, changing this spin orientation, if we imagine like some kind of like pivot in the middle, what we're doing is shifting this to this point, for example. Right? This is an abstraction of this. It's not exactly what is happening. This is an actual effect of the brush, but I don't know. This is an easy way to understand it. So it's just shifting that that pivot. So when you move your brush around, right, in this fashion, what ZBrush is doing is taking all the settings that we've been doing, roll distance and all of that, but it's spinning it around your brush, right? And this is the pivot, the center, where you have the cursor. So once again, that's what it's doing, right? So I'm gonna reduce this quite a bit, not interested in changing the spin center, but the spin angle would be more evident. So the spin angle is kind of like rotating that pivot that I just demonstrated. So you'll see just by doing that, it sort of like rotates that alpha. You can exaggerate it a bit more. And now we're starting to get something a lot more interesting in terms of what we want to achieve, which is that sort of a scar tissue, right? And this is just like rotating or spinning that alpha on its own or on itself as we drag. So that's pretty cool. Right, so I'm gonna leave that one there, another stroke, and also the spin rate. How fast is ZBrush spinning that alpha? So at 0, it was, you know, taking a while, but if we set it to 3, we get this spinning, right? So obviously it's just a matter of finding the right balance between all of these settings. So let's just go ahead and go to another space here. I think that's enough. Let's just reduce the spin rate a little bit and decrease the spin angle. Again, there's no like a formula as to, like, I won't give you numbers, exact numbers to put in here. It's better to just experiment with those. And I think this one is pretty cool, right? So it still doesn't look like a scar or anything, but it's giving you something a bit more random, more organic, which is what we're looking for. So I'm gonna increase the roll distance a little bit more, right? So that's looking good. And if you want to, you can also turn off the roll. So basically, if you turn the roll off, you still have the roll distance, but ZBrush is not gonna roll that alpha. So you get a little bit more of overlapping. So have a look at the difference here. So this is with the roll, this is without the roll. So it's very subtle. You can see in certain areas. All right, so the next thing I want to show you is in the modifiers. So if you go to the modifiers on the brush palette, you have all of these settings. They're absolutely fantastic, and they control the behavior of the brush or how the brush is applied. So what I'll do is take these trails and enable, let's say, let's go for 6 trails. Trails are basically instances of the brush. So if I go ahead and do that, you see everything is a lot more, like, you know, a lot smoother than what it was before. And that is because as I draw one stroke, ZBrush is actually drawing 6 of those you know, strokes behind it. So it's kind of like duplicating. So when you increase the amount of trails, you know, and this is not an exact number, but it's a rule of thumb, I would say, to decrease the intensity a little bit, because you're actually adding 6 strokes in one, right? And again, we can turn on the roll distance. Maybe we need more trails, actually. Let's just go for 12, so it's pretty obvious. All right, not too bad. So we're getting there. So what I'll do now is start playing around. Again, there's no an exact value that I can give you. I'm just gonna start playing with those values and see if I can find something that I like, as well as modifying the spin angle and the spin rate. So let's go for the spin rate, increasing that so it's more like a knot like this. It's pretty cool. I'm gonna reduce the spin angle so that it's less obvious, and let's increase that roll distance quite a bit. All right, so we're getting somewhere. And now what I'll do is reduce my intensity. Be a little bit more. So intensity of 12. Okay, we're getting somewhere now. So all I've done so far is play around with the roll distance just to stretch that alpha, and play around with the spin and the spin angle and the spin rate to get something like this. Now the next thing that I want to do is change my focal shift. So the focal shift is kind of like a fading between, let's see, between this point and this point, or this area of the brush, right? So if you have an alpha that is just a square like that, so imagine this is a new alpha, and you change the focal shift, what ZBrush is doing is kind of creating a fade between this point and the outer kind of like rims of this alpha. So if I go ahead and right click and change my draw size just so that you can see more, you see my focal shift is at 0. If I change it to -92, you see that secondary circle that is kind of like inside the brush get closer, and that's basically encompassing more of the stroke, but you will be able to see you know, some add effects. You'll see more of that stroke, right? So it's a bit harsher. So instead of that, we can just go ahead and push it forward and create more of a fade, right, of the same alpha. So now we get something that is a little bit more subtle, which is pretty good. I'm going to decrease the spin rate again, and I'm just going to start playing around with those values again, because it was a little bit too intense, until I get something that works a bit better. All right, I think I'm gonna set it to 2.5 and the spin ratio, the spin angle, sorry, to 0.5. All right, so I think this one is working fine. Now we can reduce my brush size, and I'm also gonna reduce the intensity a tiny bit. And if I do one stroke, this is the effect that we get, right? So this would be my brush to create a scar. Now this doesn't look exactly, doesn't look great. So we can add a few more things, but sometimes the effect of the brush, in order to generate something that is a bit more convincing, is the way that you apply it. So rather than just do like single motion, what you can do is go back and forth, because remember, this brush sort of rotates or spins around, so it allows you to sort of cover more space. So I'm going to do the same thing, going back and forth, as well as sort of jiggling the line a little bit. So just doing something like that, and varying the pressure. So by doing that, you see the way that it's applied, this is still a manual process of adding this sort of scar detail, but the effect, it's a lot more convincing. So this is the reason why I wanted to show you this process and to show you this particular effect of this scar, because you can create something that it's very, very cool, very convincing, very organic, but you shouldn't expect that the brush does all the work for you, right? It's just a way to, speed up the workflow, really. And now we have kind of like this scar tissue, generated with a simple brush, and that's pretty much it. So I'm just going to do a quick recap of what I did, and then I'll show you a couple more things about the brushes in ZBrush. So the first thing was to select the standard brush. You can use any brush as a base, but I found that the standard brush is, for the most part, the best way to understand and get started with the custom brushes in ZBrush. So the standard brush, I turn off the lazy mouse, I turn on the roll distance, and I set the roll distance, let's set it to 7.5, just to round out that number. I left the C add on, I selected alpha 54, right? Again, you can use any alpha, and I'll show you that in a second. And in the brush palette, under the modifiers and orientation, I set the spin angle to 0.5, the spin rate to 2.5, and in the modifiers, I enable the 12 trails. So I just added 12 instances of that brush. As I said, once you have this brush, all you have to do is create your own alphas and variate a bunch of different scar brushes. So I'm going to select this alpha 53. Let's see if that one gives us something interesting. Right, so it gives us a bit of a sharper effect, right? Oops. Oh, the other thing that I changed was the focal shift, right? Just to make it a bit sharper. I quite like the alpha 54 brush just to create that scar. You undo all of that. And one more thing that you can do is obviously invert the effect. So now this is sort of like pushing in, and you're sort of carving into the model, right? And it's quite good. The effect, I mean, it's quite convincing. It's just a matter of, like I said, how you applied that effect into the mesh. All right, so let's just keep that add. So, and yep, so I'm happy with this effect. So the next thing would be to save that brush so that you can build your asset library. So the first thing I would do is change the credits of that brush. So let's go to the brush palette. I'm gonna turn this off. And here under the brush palette, you have this create palette. So if you expand that out, you can edit these brush settings. Obviously, it's a standard brush, but I customized it in a way that I can say this is kind of like my brush that I tweaked. So you can click on edit credits. You can give it, you can put your name there or your studio name, whatever you want, and you can add a website, right? And then just click OK. Now to generate the icon for the brush, what I'll do is just create one really quickly by selecting a new sphere, making it a Polymesh 3D. There we go. And again, I'm just gonna divide it a few times so that we can get a good, a good effect. Increase my brush size, and this is gonna be the scar brush. So I'm just gonna create quite a big scar so that I recognize it the next time that I want to use it. All right, that should be enough to recognize it as a scar brush. What I like to do is just change the material. So I'm going to click on the toy plastic. You can use any other shiny material. I found them to be the best option. So the toy plastic is kind of like the default one that would look very similar to other brushes in ZBrush, but you know, you can use something like basic, the Madcap, anything you want. So I'm gonna go to toy plastic, go to the brush palette, and here in the icon, I'm just gonna click it once. And as you can see, it just gives me that icon based on what I have in the canvas. Now you can also load your own custom icon if you wanna make it in Photoshop. All you have to do is press the Alt key and click on select icon, and that will bring up a browser that you can select. All right, so now that we have the icon as well as the credits, we can go ahead and click on Save As, and that will give us our brush, and we can just load it anytime that we want to. All right, and just to wrap up this video, I'm going to show you one more thing that I think is really cool in terms of poly painting and using these brushes or these custom brushes as, you know, another tool to paint or poly paint a creature or a character. So what I have here is obviously a brush that allows you to add sculpted details, right? But if, let's say, select the skin shade 4 so that it's easy to see, I'm going to fill it with a kind of like a fleshy color, fill object. Because this brush is actually using an alpha that has, you know, kind of like transparency in a way, we can, as long as we have this alpha enabled, we can also turn on the RGB, right? And these two switches are on this draw palette, right? So you have the alpha, right, paint with an alpha, and the RGB, which is basically converting whatever you have in the brush as a painting brush. So now not only I'm affecting the model, but I'm also gonna be adding some color. So I'm just gonna select something like that. So as I sculpt, I'm also adding a little bit of color where the alpha, you know, where the white values of the alpha are. There we go, right? And also you can hold the shift key, and if you hold the shift key, you also see that the RGB is still enabled in this case. So the smooth brush is a way to smooth everything, not just the details. I'm gonna reduce to a lower subdivision level so this faster, but also a way to sort of blur out some of those details in the colors, right? So I just thought I'd give you that extra tip because it's pretty handy, and I know it could be very useful once you understand how things work. All right, so I'm going to leave this video here. Hopefully you have found it useful. And if you like this type of assets, I have a few packs online with custom brushes that I created for myself to detail skin or detail creatures and that sort of thing. And I'll put a link in the description of this video in case you're interested. I'll see you next time. Cheers.